Okay, so we started the consultations, budget consultations, together with the Honorable Minister in April, and we've covered schools starting from Navua, Nosori, then we moved over to Nandi, Singatoka, Lautoka, and now we're here at Penang Sangam this afternoon. We'll be at Tavua. And then in the afternoon, we have consultations with the private sector at Natumbo High School. So what we normally do at all these consultations before we invite the schools, the students to give us their suggestions, their ideas on what they want to see in the budget, we provide this presentation just to give everyone an update on what's happening in the economy, how the economy is performing, as well as the budget, how the budget's put together, what government looks at when we compile the budget, both in terms of revenue and expenditure. So we'll begin with the presentation. If you have any questions or you want clarification on anything that comes up on the slides, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll be happy to take on your questions. So this first chart shows you the economic growth for Fiji since 2008. So you'll note that from 2010 until 2017, and even for 2018, 2019, government is projecting positive economic growth. So this data is put together by the Reserve Bank of Fiji in consultation with other government agencies and the Bureau of Statistics. So you'll note that in 2009, we had a couple of cyclones. We had Cyclone Jean, Meek, Thomas, and so those events also have an impact on economic growth. So you'll notice that following TC Winston, there were shortages in a lot of food items, fresh vegetables and fruits in particular. So that has an impact on the economy. Also, many sectors like manufacturing had an impact on their production levels. Sorry, should we go back? Yeah, so you'll note that from 2010, we've had positive growth, around 3% in 2010. We had a huge increase in growth in 2014 at 5.6%. For this year, we are projecting 3.6%. You'll note that in 2016, initially we projected growth at 2%, but after taking into account the damages and the impact on the economy, growth was revised down to 2%, but nonetheless still positive. So in 2018 and 2019, we're still expecting growth to be positive. So what are the sectors that contribute to economic growth? You'll note the first section there refers to all the primary sector that includes agriculture. Agriculture contributes about 0.31% to growth. Fisheries and forestry around 0.02 and 0.01. So small contributions, but we believe there's potential for these sectors to contribute more in the future. In terms of industries, this captures manufacturing, construction industry, mining, electricity and water. You'll note that manufacturing contributed strongly to growth at around 0.56%. This also includes production of sugar. Construction industry around 0.33%, and we expect this to continue to contribute strongly, as you'll note that following TC Winston, there were a lot of constructions taking place. People were rebuilding homes. Government too has embarked on an extensive reconstruction rehabilitation program for all the schools that were affected. Not only schools, but public buildings, so government offices, health centers, and other government quarters that were damaged during the cyclone. Mining is around 0.04%, and as I mentioned earlier, electricity and water contributing 0.10%. We also have services sector, so that includes financial services, contributes about 0.39%. Transport around 0.37%, same as similar for wholesale, retail, and accommodation. So wholesale, retail, and accommodation also captures a lot of the activities in the tourism sector. Information and communication, that's around 0.2%. And then we have other smaller sectors, public admin, education, professional services, and other services at around 0.15%. So you'll note that growth in the economy is broad-based. Altogether, we have about 21 sectors in the economy, but these are the sectors that are contributing positively to growth. So the Reserve Bank also looks at, as a measurement of growth or to indicate how the economy is doing, they look at investment indicators. So between January and September in 2016, the value of building permits issued, that increased by 12.7%. So each time you need to construct a building, you need to get a building permit. So looking at the value of building permits issued, that increased by 12.7%. The value of work put in place also increased by about 10.5%. And cement sales, domestic cement sales, increased by 11.1%. Investment of imports of investment goods. So investment goods, this relate to the heavy machineries that companies and other construction items, that's included in the investment goods. So that increased by around 15.7%. Government CAPEX refers to capital expenditures that are incurred by government, so expenditure on roads, jetties, buildings, bridges, that also increased by 7.8%. There were some declines in new investment lending, about 10.3%, lending for real estate, 17.8%, and lending for building and construction, declined by about 1%. The other indicators that the Reserve Bank looks at to measure how well or the level of economic activity that's going on in the economy, they look at the new vehicle registrations. So that increased strongly by about 27.5%. Second-hand vehicle registration also increased by 7.8%. So in the last 2 years, government has focused on import duties for vehicles, so that was reduced. And the idea there was to enable people to import fuel-efficient vehicles. So that saves on our import bills, and it's also much kinder to the environment. So you'll note that a lot of the hybrid vehicles that are running on the roads now, that's a result of the government incentives that were introduced 2 years ago. And then we have new lending to wholesale retail trade, that increased by about 13.2%. Imports of consumption goods. So these consumption goods includes food, clothing, all the items that we don't manufacture here, but we import from overseas, that's covered in consumption goods. That also increased by about 4.7%. PAYE collections increased by about 5%. So PAYE is pay as you earn taxes. So every person that works and earns salary above 16,000, they pay PAYE to FERCA. New job advertisements also increased by about 15%. So here, the Reserve Bank only captures jobs that are advertised in the Fiji Times, but we've asked them to also include jobs that are advertised in the Fiji Sun. So these numbers are likely higher than 4.9%, 15%. So personal remittances, that also increased by 5%. Personal remittances refers to your relatives or friends or Fiji citizens that live abroad and work and send money back home to support their families. So that also increased by 5%. Vatable consumption. So despite the VAT rate being reduced to 15%, from 15 to 9%, we still saw an increase in VAT collections. And just in terms of new lending to private individuals, that declined in 2016 by around 4.7%. As I mentioned earlier, this chart shows the registration for new vehicles and second-hand vehicles. So you'll see in 2005, for second-hand vehicles, there were around 6,088 new second-hand vehicles imported, and the new were around 3,363. Last year, that increased by about 7.8%. We saw increase in second-hand vehicles to 10,152 from the 6,000 in 2005. And for new vehicles, that increased to around 4,920 from 3,300 in 2005. Retail sales survey, again, this measures the sales within the economy that on average that's been growing at around 7.1% from 2007, and there was a huge increase in 2016 to about 17.2%. So inflation, this chart measures the changes in prices in the consumer basket. You'll note that inflation in the economy is usually low at around 2%, but following TC Winston, that increased to around 5%. And the good news is last month, when we first did this presentation, inflation was at around 5.5%. So you'll note that as the economy picks up and supply of fresh fruits and vegetables now in abundance, you don't see shortages in the market now, and the prices have also come down. So that's reflected from in this 4.1%. It used to be 5.5% last month, and now that's come down to 4.1%. Foreign reserves, this is an important chart. It notes all the foreign currency that the Reserve Bank holds. Traditionally, the Reserve Bank has a benchmark of around 4%. So on this side of the axis, on the left side of the axis is the dollar value, and on this side is the months of import. So you'll see in 2005, government had foreign reserves of around 549 million. That has since increased to now 2.16 billion, and you'll note that's sufficient to cover about 4.8%. So we're well above the benchmark of 4 months, 5.8 months of import cover, well above the 4 months benchmark. So you all know what foreign reserves are. So when we import goods from overseas, for example, if we import food from Australia, we need to pay for those in Australian dollars. Similarly, whatever we buy from New Zealand or China or Japan, all our trading partners, we need to purchase those in their currency. So the fact that we have around 2.1 billion and 5.8 months of import cover, that shows that the economy is doing well. And as you note there on the slide, that foreign reserve is now at an all-time high as at April this year of 2.1 billion. You'll see that it's the first time we've reached the 2 billion mark. Previously, the highest before then was 1.9 billion and 1.944 in 2015, 1.922 billion, and for the first time we've reached 2.1 billion. So that shows that the economy is doing well and our reserves are well above comfortable levels. Fiscal performance. So fiscal deficit, this refers to government's budget. The deficit is just the difference between revenue, what government collects, and expenditure, what the government spends. So you'll note that as a developing country, government has always had a deficit budget. So you'll note there in 2000 we had about 3.4% deficit. That increased to around 6.2% in 2001. But on average, since 2007, we've managed to reduce a fiscal deficit to around 2.3% on average. So fiscal deficit has been reducing from 2010. You'll note that for this year's budget, 2016-2017, that increased by 4.7%. But that also is a result of the huge expenditure that government has committed for rehabilitation, TC Winston rehabilitation. So you'll note that the funding allocated for rehabilitation of schools and public buildings, that's about 208 million. So, as I mentioned earlier, the deficit is the difference between total revenue and total expenditure. This chart reflects what government collects in terms of revenue. You'll see in 2004, government collected about 1.1 billion, and since then, revenue has tripled to about 3.1 billion in this year's budget. So revenue has grown strongly. You'll see that the arrow is steeper, so stronger growth from 2010, from 1.5 billion to now 3.1 billion. And revenue as a percent of GDP is around 30%. So what are the categories of revenue the government collects? You all know value-added tax. That's a huge contributor. In fact, the largest contributor to government revenue at around 30%. We have direct taxes. Direct taxes are PAYE and corporate tax. As I mentioned earlier, all individual employees, they pay PAYE, and the companies, your corporates, they pay corporate tax. The customs on the green part, this covers fiscal duty, excise duty. These are the taxes that are levied at the border when you import goods. This is what FIRCA collects at the border. Service turnover tax, that's around 2%. Water resource tax is 2% also. Departure tax, what you pay as you leave the airports, that's 5%. Stamp duty, 3%. Fees and charges, 3%. And sale of government assets at around 8%. And a few other revenues contribute about 3%. So these are the major contributors to government revenue. Total expenditure. We've seen growth in our overall expenditure. You'll note that in 2001, government expenditure was only 1.3 billion. Over the years, the expenditure has risen nominally. Now, government expenditure is at 3.6 billion. So what government largely funds in terms of the budget, it focuses on infrastructure development. So you'll see a lot of road construction happening around the country, roads and bridges. We have spending, huge increase in spending on health, education, access to justice, and social protection, which I will elaborate on in the other slides. So altogether, government spending on these areas is around 34% of GDP. Expenditure mix, this is also an important slide. So expenditure is broken into two. You have operating and you have capital expenditure. So operating expenditure is what government pays for its daily operational costs. So salaries and wages, printing, transport, all the payments that we need in order to run government, that's covered what we call operating expenditure. Capital expenditure refers to spending that's made in order to build things. So roads, bridges, buildings, jetties, that's all capital expenditure. Capital expenditure also relates to investments, so government investments in the economy. So you'll see that in 2004, around 83% of government's total budget was spent on operating expenditure, and only 17% was for investment. 17% was for building roads and bridges, hospitals, health centers, But the bulk of it was just operating expenditure, so paying for wages and salaries and all the other running costs of government. In this year's budget, the mix has changed. Over the years, we've tried to improve the operating and capital mix. And in this year's budget, you'll see that operating expenditure has declined from 83% to now 60%. And on the other hand, for capital expenditure, that has increased from 17% to 40%. So in terms of the quality of budget, we say that the quality of budget has improved because we're spending more on investment expenditures. So these are some of the areas of focus in the budget where government has increased spending substantially. So this chart covers the spending for roads, bridges and jetties. You'll note that in 2004, what government spent on these areas was only 55 million. Today it's 527 million. So we've had a huge increase in spending towards roads, bridges and jetties since 2011, and that is now at 527 million. Next. On water and energy, we've increased investments to ensure that more and more people have access to safe and clean drinking water. Government also in 2014 introduced the free water scheme and also continued to allocate funding for rural electrification and grid extension. So you'll note that from 2013, funding for water and energy has increased substantially to 168 in 2014 and now to 337 million in the current year's budget, compared to 2004 where government only spent 92 million on these areas. For education, in 2014, government introduced the free education program, also the tertiary education loan scheme, and the Stoppers Scholarship. So you'll note that in 2014, spending towards education was about 270 million, and today that's increased to about 598 million, almost 600 million. For the health sector, spending has been focused on improving access and improving the services. So you'll note that we are putting out more, there are more health centers and rural health facilities now. Part of the expenditure is also to ensure that the facilities that are existing are functioning and are well maintained. Also in 2014, government introduced the free medicine program and provided funding for recruitment of about 200 new nurses and doctors. So making that comparison again, in 2004, spending for health was around 132 million, and now it is at 244 million. So we're seeing a significant increase over the years for funding towards health sector. Government operating savings, as I mentioned earlier, with the switch in the expenditure mix, now that we're focusing more on capital investments as opposed to operating expenditure, you'll note that operating revenue, what government collects, is more than sufficient to cover all of its operating expenditure. So government doesn't borrow any funding to cover its operating expenditure. That's all covered from the revenue the government collects. And even then, there are savings. So that savings is channeled towards capital spending. So the borrowings the government currently undertakes is only to fund capital expenditure. Government debt, this is an important slide. It shows what government borrows, as I mentioned earlier, to fund part of the budget. So in 2004, government debt was at 2.28 billion. That has increased over the years on a nominal basis from 2.28 billion to now 4.96 billion, 4.97. But you'll note that the red bar here shows the proportion of government debt to GDP, gross domestic product. So what all the goods and services that are produced in the economy, that's GDP, and this red line just shows the proportion of government debt to GDP. So you'll note that despite the nominal debt levels growing, because the economy is doing well, and that is the denominator, GDP, your debt to GDP ratio is in fact declining. So from 2000 and around 2010, that has steadily declined to now it's around less than 50%, 48.6% as a percentage of GDP. So it just shows that government debt is manageable. It's in a better position than it was previously, and that's a reflection of the strength of the economy. So in summary, the economy, we expect the economy to continue to grow. 8 years of consecutive growth. So for 2017, growth is projected at 3.6%. For the medium term, the prospects for growth remain favorable. You'll note that in 2018 and 2019, we're projecting positive growth of around 3%. We're seeing continued private sector investment and optimism. So the surveys that the Reserve Bank undertake with the private sector show that the private sector investment has increased and that there's positive sentiment that they will continue to invest in the economy. In terms of fiscal policy, fiscal management, we've continued to manage the budget well, as you've noted from the deficit and debt charts. Deficit has, as a percent of GDP, has been declining. The uptick in 2016, this current budget is basically to cover the TC Winston rehabilitation. As a percent of GDP, our debt has declined to less than 50% now. Again, higher capital spending, so government is focusing more on investment spending as opposed to operating expenditures, and so we're seeing increases in our operating savings. Growth, as I mentioned, the 21 sectors contribute to growth. So growth is broad-based, and there's potential in some of the sectors for further growth. Foreign reserves are at an all-time high at 2.1 billion. For the first time, we're seeing foreign reserves reach that level. And inflation was high earlier on as a result of TC Winston, but now we're seeing inflation starting to drop. So from 5.5 last month, it has now come down to 4.1%, and we expect that to continue to decline to around 3% over the medium term. So that, ladies and gentlemen, covers the presentation on how the economy is performing as well as the government budget. So on the slide here we have the email address, the postal address, and also the physical address. If you want to make your submission, you'll have the opportunity to do so after this. But should you want to email those to us, we'll welcome that, and that's the email address. You want to take that down, or you could post it to that address, the box number given there. And if you're visiting Suva in the next few weeks, you can drop off your submissions at the Ministry of Economy. So that, ladies and gentlemen, captures the presentation. We'll be happy to take any questions. If you want any clarifications on the slide presentation, please feel free to ask. The Minister, as the Education Officer mentioned, Minister will be arriving soon, and so he will talk about the budget process, what happens in Parliament, and then we'll be happy to take on your submission. So any questions you have on the presentation, please feel free to raise your hand, and I can answer your questions. Thank you.
She would have mentioned to you that we like to keep these sessions very, very informal. So please feel free to ask any questions you want to ask. we're here to answer any questions. Don't think any questions are too hard or too silly. The whole idea is that for you to be able to get a idea of what are the things that we do consider when we formulate the budget. When we stand up and deliver the budget, now you know what debt to GDP means, all of these sorts of things. Because we need you to have an understanding. Of course, we need you to also be able to give us any of your input. If you think that there are certain things that are important to you, that you like to have in the budget, or you like included, or do you think that government should consider, we all need to have your input. As the PS would have mentioned to you, she may have mentioned to you that the budget, we deliver the budget in the evening now in Parliament, so all of you can watch it, you can listen to it. Once the budget is delivered in Parliament, which is in June, we then have to have 6 days for the Parliament to go off and consider the budget. Then we come back and debate the budget. When we debate the budget, that's when the budget gets approved. Of course, today you may, some of the issues that may have been raised, you may actually think, well, you may get some ideas after this. We can also receive your submissions after this. This is the address you can send it to. You can email it to that address. You can post it or hand deliver it, but we need your submissions at least within the next 2 weeks or so. So you may go back as a school or as a class and may want to discuss matters and want to raise those matters. One of the reasons why we are doing this, of course, is that we want to consult students because you are really the future of the country. Nearly 70% of the population of Fiji is below the age of 40. So 69.4% of the population is below the age of 40. So in a few years' time, you'll be mothers and fathers, you'll be working, you'll be parents, you'll be also maybe business leaders, you may be farmers, you may be engineers, you may be nurses, doctors, whatever the case may be. You'll be contributing citizens of this country. You already are contributing to the country. It's important for you to understand, because a lot of times what we have found that people in Fiji, a lot of people don't understand things. They simply just comment on things, or somebody comes along because you don't understand. They'll tell you a story and you'll believe it without knowing exactly what the truth is. So this is the reason why we're doing these consultations. Let's continue with our questions, please. Thank you. Please don't hesitate to ask any questions if you want to make any comments.
Prayer, and then the national anthem, and we have the welcoming by the
Isaac won them.
That's it. Coming. All right, coming.